All right, so historical speeches. I'm Michael Aleman on period four. So Abraham Lincoln, a house divided. So Abraham Lincoln, just some knowledge is that he was the 16th president of the United States, and he led us through probably our darkest time, the American Civil War. So this speech was given in order to unite our divided country. He wanted to have us as one force instead of two different sides, the North and South. So the audience of the speech was pretty much all American voters because this was before the election of 1860, and he was giving this as his nomination speech pretty much. So as I said, it was delivered to everyone, and the main topic of the speech was slavery. So this was an issue that Lincoln intended to tackle in his presidency. He wanted to abolish it if elected as president. So just some context. So before the Civil War, tensions were definitely rising between the North and South over whether slavery should continue to be expanded or not. And this was something that Lincoln wanted to address to the people in his speech. So the main idea was, like I said, the conflict between the North and South was steadily intensifying. Things were getting a lot more tough between the two. There was a lot more hatred, and eventually, obviously, the Civil War would undergo, and that would be a terrible thing that would happen. So, some key points: the problems of slavery in the United States, and Lincoln also directly addressed the Dred Scott decision, which was the separate but equal court ruling, and how it affected pretty much the people. So the level of success, Lincoln's success with the speech, he was able to pretty much put an end to slavery after the war with the passage of the 13th Amendment. And he also delivered the Emancipation Proclamation, which also helped slaves during the time. So some strategies that he used allusions. He referred to Jesus when saying, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." This helped him argue that union of the American states was needed to survive, just because if there was disunion, if there was separation, then the United States would not be the force that it was. So a rhetorical question. So some of them he would make were, why was the amendment expressly declaring the right of the people to exclude slavery voted down, or why was the Dred Scott decision held up? These are just a few examples of how Lincoln would evoke the audience's reflection on previous events. And that's what rhetorical questions do. They pretty much cause the audience to listen, and it really affects them greater when asked these questions. So he concluded the speech with, "To meet and overthrow the power of the dynasty is the work now before all of us who prevent that consummation." He's referring to the role that slavery would becoming lawful in the states would pretty much play. So this helps elevate his ethos because he has a lot of confidence, and he pretty much wants his audience to understand that he will get this done. And ending with firm affirmation, success is foreseeable. It just instills confidence into all of his audience, him pretty much telling them, "Listen, I want you guys to know that I will do this for you," which is very powerful in the speech. So Martin Luther King Jr., I have a dream. So Martin Luther King Jr. was an activist, and he was definitely the leader of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So this speech was called for civil and economic rights, and pretty much an end to racism in the United States. So his audience was not only the oppressed African Americans, however, it was all Americans, since King believed that the country would be stronger if everyone shared equal opportunity. So the topic of the speech was definitely equal rights for African Americans, and some context was from the 1880s onwards. Jim Crow laws at state level had restricted black voting rights and introduced segregation. So President Woodrow Wilson produced federal level segregation in the armed services, post office, and other parts of the federal machine. Pretty much, segregation was growing around the country, and Martin Luther King and the other leaders of the civil rights movement believed that this was something that shouldn't be happening. So therefore, after giving this speech, well, the main idea was just to end racial segregation, and some of the key points were economic equality and voting rights protection. So Martin Luther King's level of success, he was able to secure the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which both ended up being landmark triumphs for his movement. So rhetorical strategies. So he employs ethos just by beginning with "I am happy to join with you today in what will go down as history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation." This is like a call for unity and to take stand against discrimination. So this speech is also very rich in imagery, and he uses various phrases to paint pictures. He does this in order to provide like a positive outlook on the negative things that are happening with racism and segregation. And he's talking about how a cohesive society would be uh, would not easily fall prey to discrimination. He does this just to show how like equality could just be overall a lot more successful instead of just the disunification that was going on. So application of pathos. So you can definitely feel like a sense of King's soul in the fact that he's like pouring out really all of his emotions. His firm faith in unity and benevolence is evident in every stage. He's clearly angry in his speech just because African Americans are being kept from finding happiness. However, his speech definitely, like, as it goes on, you feel it emotionally getting stronger due to he's making promises pretty much, and he's also talking about all the negative aspects of what's happening in Black people's daily lives. So this inspires his motive to apply energy and life into relationships between the two races, and he seeks to bring together the Black and white communities to help them live as equals. And logos. So King reasons strongly as he speaks of the losses of the Black community is bearing because America is defaulted on its promise. He pretty much uses logos in order to get facts from American history to support his logic. So he uses a peaceful method of ending the misery, um, and just talks about pretty much history in general, just to let the crowd know that this is not something new that's happening. This is something that has been going on for a long time, and he wants his audience to understand that through peaceful and nonviolent methods, he's going to continue fighting no matter how long for pretty much ending the struggle. And yeah, that's what he does, and he uses history and logic to support him, to back him. And finally, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, The Solitude of Self. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a very well educated women's rights activist. She was part of the abolitionist movement, and her, alongside Susan B. Anthony, delivered a few of the most influential speeches at the very beginning of the feminist movement. So the purpose of the speech was to create civil and political change for women, as well, in the same way that Martin Luther King did for African Americans. So her audience was pretty much all white men that believed that the right to vote should not be granted to women, and she also spoke to the large feminist backing that she had gained. So obviously the topic of the speech is women's rights. However, it also has to do with individualism and the fact that women should be treated as individuals. So some context to the speech: the Seneca Falls Convention, in which he displayed the Declaration of Sentiments, which was directly modeled after the Declaration of Independence, pretty much drew much of her support for the women's rights movements, and also showed examples of how men oppress women. So the main idea of the speech is that women want to be free in the same way men are, have representation and taxation, and also vote. Pretty much have the ability to change laws that promote male dominance and privileges. Um, and yeah, just she believed that women deserve equal rights because they are individuals. So some of the key points that she makes are the double standard of sexual morality, also the ability to enter professions and attain a college education, and her level of success. So, although she wasn't able to see it, 2 decades after her death, the 19th Amendment was passed, granting women suffrage or the right for all women to vote. So, some rhetorical strategies that she uses imagery in order to describe the cruelty of denying a woman her right to complete an education. She says to throw obstacle in the way of complete education is like pointing out the eyes to denying the rights of property, like cutting off the hands. So this use of imagery pretty much and applies some gruesome images into the reader's mind, but she intentionally does this in order to compare pretty much the inability for women to be able to get an education. She compares this to the violence of cutting off hands, which is actually really smart because it shows how both of them are very damaging and demoralizing to a person. So her use of ethos, she was very well known at the time as a leader of the feminist movement. So she exercises her own authority in order to stress the point of women's rights, but her credibility was like on a highlight of her speech immediately just because as soon as she stood up to give it, everybody she demanded the attention just because everybody already knew who she was. So pathos. So in order to promote individual rights, Stanton's tone is poetic and figurative. She uses many rhetorical figures and personal examples in order to justify her argument in favor of individual rights. She does this by talking about like shared experience of solitude by using the analogy of fitting an army before each man bears his burden. So these are just a few of the analogies that she uses. The Russian prince expressing his loneliness in prison, and Jesus' crucifixion to visualize his claim. So these examples have male characters in order to prove that even males could be victims of isolation. So this pretty much appeals to the individuality of a human being, um, therefore going back to the solitude of self title. And finally, she ends with a rhetorical question, and this is very significant because ending with an open-ended question allows her to leave the readers reflecting upon the speech. And yeah, this provokes a feeling of responsibility and disgrace against oneself as to what one can do to change the situation.